The scent of honeysuckle, heavy and sweet, usually brought a comforting peace to my mornings. It drifted through the open kitchen window, mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, a ritual I'd kept sacred since George passed. But on that Tuesday, a dull ache throbbed behind my eyes, stronger than the scent of any bloom. It was a familiar ache these days, one that settled deep in my bones, a constant companion since the bank statement arrived. My name is Margaret Caldwell, and I'm 72 years old. I've lived a full life, or so I thought, raised two wonderful children, helped George build his small but respectable construction business from the ground up, and always prided myself on our strong, honest family. Our home, a sturdy two-story colonial with a wraparound porch and the best rose bushes in Fairview, was a testament to our life's work, a tangible symbol of everything we'd built together, brick by painstaking brick. But the paper in my trembling hand told a different story. It was the quarterly statement for the joint savings account, the one George and I had nurtured for decades, our nest egg, our legacy, the funds we had set aside meticulously for Stephen and Linda, for their future, for their children's college funds, for a comfortable retirement that would ease their burdens. It was supposed to hold over $250,000, but the balance stared back at me, a stark, mocking zero. I remembered the day George first opened that account, nearly 40 years ago. He'd come home from the bank, his face alight with quiet pride, the crisp new passbook in his hand. "This, Maggie," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is for them, for Stephen and his family when the time comes. We'll build it up little by little so they never have to struggle like we did." He'd squeezed my hand, his calloused palm warm against mine, and I'd felt a surge of love so profound it almost hurt. The dreams we'd poured into that account were as real as the pennies and dollars we deposited. Now it was empty, not a single cent, just a long, dizzying string of zeros. My mind, usually as sharp as a tack, began to race, tumbling over explanations, each more terrifying than the last. Had there been a mistake? A clerical error? But the bank logo, the account number, my name, George's name, it was all correct. The numbers were irrefutable. My first thought, a raw, piercing whisper in my heart, was Stephen, our son, our only son. After George passed, Stephen, being the meticulous one, had helped me sort through everything, including our finances. He'd insisted on being added to the account for ease of management to help me navigate the complexities of life without George. I trusted him implicitly. He was our rock, steady and reliable, the spitting image of his father in so many ways, the same thoughtful frown when he concentrated, the same quiet strength. How could he? Could he? I walked over to the old mahogany desk in the living room, the one George had inherited from his own father. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and dusty paper, a comforting scent that usually brought back a flood of warm memories. Now it just felt cold. I ran my fingers over the carved lions on its legs, trying to ground myself. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum solo in the quiet house. I remembered Stephen's earnest face when he'd explained the changes to the accounts, his patient tone as he walked me through the online banking portal. He'd promised me everything was secure, that he'd look after me just as his father would have wanted. A wave of nausea washed over me. Shame, hot and bitter, mixed with a chilling fear. Shame at the very thought of accusing my own son, the boy I'd raised, the man I loved more than life itself, and fear of what this revelation truly meant. It wasn't just about the money, not really. It was about the trust, the unspoken vows, the very fabric of our family. Had it all been a lie? Had I been so blind? The phone felt heavy in my hand as I picked it up, my fingers fumbling for Stephen's number. I needed answers, but what would I say? How do you ask your child if he's stolen your life savings? The words caught in my throat, raw and painful. I closed my eyes, picturing Stephen's kind smile, the way he always held my hand a little too tightly, reassuringly. This couldn't be true. It simply couldn't. Yet the empty balance screamed otherwise. I had no idea then that this was just the beginning. I was about to discover a truth that would not only shatter my perception of Stephen, but also reveal a side of my beloved George I never knew existed. And what was worse, I was about to realize that sometimes the greatest acts of love can look exactly like the deepest betrayals. To truly understand what happened next and how one family's hidden past came crashing down on its present, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss a single part of this unfolding story. I thought I knew exactly what happened, and my heart was breaking. But the deeper I dug, the more I questioned everything. The truth I found wasn't just about money. It was about the very soul of my family, and a secret only George knew. I needed to know. And if you're reading this, you need to know too. You won't believe what I uncovered next. A truth that touched a part of my past I thought was long buried. The morning after finding the empty bank statement, the honeysuckle outside my window felt like a cruel joke. How could such sweetness exist alongside such a bitter reality? My hand still trembled as I held the phone, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't bring myself to confront Stephen directly, not yet. Not without more answers, or at least a clearer head. The thought of his face, hurt, and perhaps even angry, was more than I could bear. Was it cowardice, or just a desperate need to avoid pain? I wondered, my internal voice echoing Eric Burns' child ego state, wanting to retreat from the harsh adult truth. I tried to recall every conversation I'd had with Stephen about the finances since George's passing last year. He had been so helpful, so attentive. He'd come over every other Sunday, bringing Linda, who always brought her famous lemon bars, a small comfort that now tasted like ash in my memory. He'd sit at the kitchen table, the one George and I had bought on our first anniversary, spreading out papers, explaining the intricacies of trusts and dividends. "Don't you worry about a thing, Mom," he'd always say, his hand over mine. Dad made sure everything was set up, and I'm here to handle the rest. His words, once so reassuring, now felt like a carefully crafted script. My mind drifted back to a conversation from a few months ago. We were sitting on the porch swing, the wood creaking a familiar rhythm as the evening cicadas hummed their lullaby. "Stephen," I'd asked, trying to sound casual, "is everything with the investments all right? You know, for your future?" He'd smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Mom, everything is perfectly fine. Dad was a smart man. He set us up well." His response had been immediate, almost too quick. At the time, I'd dismissed it as his characteristic efficiency. Now, a cold prickle of doubt traced its way down my spine. Had he been lying even then? I spent the next few days in a haze, moving through the house like a ghost. The quiet was deafening. I found myself staring at George's old armchair, still in its usual spot by the fireplace, the faint scent of his pipe tobacco lingering in the fabric. He'd loved that chair, and he'd loved Stephen so much. How could Stephen betray his father's trust, George's legacy? The thought was a searing brand on my soul. My parent ego state, full of judgment and disappointment, clashed with the heartbroken child within. I decided to start my own investigation. Small steps, like sifting through old photographs. Maybe there was something I'd missed. I pulled out dusty boxes from the attic, filled with memories,
faded Polaroids of Stephen as a toddler, George in his hard hat beaming beside a newly finished house, Christmases, birthdays, anniversaries. Each image was a painful reminder of the life we'd shared, the trust we'd built. I picked up an old photo of George and Stephen, both grinning, covered in paint splatters from a long-ago weekend project. Stephen, maybe 10 years old, was looking up at his father with such adoration. My chest tightened. Then, tucked away at the very bottom of one box, beneath a stack of old tax returns and George's cherished fishing lures, I found a small, worn, leather-bound ledger. It wasn't our main household ledger. This one was older, its pages yellowed and brittle. I recognized George's neat, almost clinical handwriting. Dates, names, and large sums of money were meticulously recorded. It looked like business dealings, but some names were unfamiliar. My eyes scanned the pages until they landed on one entry that sent a jolt through me. Payment to Sterling Group, C. Harrison Settlement, paid in full. The date was just weeks after George passed, and the amount listed was almost exactly what had disappeared from our savings account. Sterling Group? C. Harrison? These names meant nothing to me. George had always been so transparent about his business. He had never mentioned a Sterling Group or a C. Harrison settlement. My mind raced. Was this something illicit? Something hidden from me all these years? The ledger was a physical representation of a secret, a heavy weight in my hands. The narrative I had for George, honest, open, a true partner, began to fray at the edges. I felt a strange, cold dread settle over me. It wasn't just Stephen anymore. It was George, too. And then I found it, tucked inside the last page of the ledger, a crisp, folded, legal document. It wasn't a will or a deed. It was a formal, legally binding, non-disclosure agreement signed by George, dated nearly 20 years ago. The other signature belonged to Charles Harrison. The document stated that in exchange for a substantial sum of money from George, Charles Harrison agreed never to disclose certain proprietary information regarding the operations of Caldwell Construction that could cause significant reputational and financial damage. My breath hitched. George, with a secret? A secret so potent that it required a non-disclosure agreement? All these years he'd been the picture of integrity. I remembered his booming laugh, the way he'd always said, "Honesty is the only policy, Maggie." Had he been living a lie? The thought sent a chilling tremor through me. This wasn't just about Stephen now. It was about George's hidden past. And it suggested Stephen hadn't stolen the money. He had paid it. But why? And what terrible secret was George hiding that required such a desperate payoff? I looked at the document again, the stark legal language feeling like a punch to the gut. The sum matched, the timing too. Stephen hadn't taken the money for himself. He had given it away under what seemed like a dark cloud. But to whom? And why would he keep this from me? The anger at Stephen began to transform into a confusing mix of fear and a desperate need to understand. Everything I thought I knew about our secure, stable world felt like it was crumbling around me. And that's when the second twist hit me, like a cold splash of water, revealing a deeper, more personal connection to this Charles Harrison than I could have ever imagined. The name, buried deep in my memory, finally surfaced with a terrifying clarity. This wasn't just a business secret. This was personal. This was family. This was Charles Harrison, my own older brother who disappeared from our lives nearly 50 years ago after a bitter family dispute over George's business. A dispute I had tried my hardest to forget. I had never imagined he would resurface in such a way, tied to George's hidden fears and Stephen's actions. I stood there, the ledger and the non-disclosure agreement slipping from my numb fingers, scattering across the polished floorboards. The honeysuckle outside my window suddenly seemed suffocating. All these years, I had walked through life believing in the unwavering honesty of my husband and the quiet integrity of my son. Now, two shocking truths had collided, leaving me reeling. My son hadn't betrayed me. He was shielding me from a ghost George had tried to bury. And that ghost was my own flesh and blood, a man I hadn't spoken to in half a century. The silence in the house was no longer comforting. It was screaming with unspoken secrets. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of unknown truths, and I still didn't know why Stephen kept all of this from me, or what George had done that required such a desperate act. My world, built on decades of assumed transparency, had just shattered. What else was hidden beneath the surface of our perfect family? I had to find out, no matter the cost.
The air in the house grew thick with unspoken secrets. Every corner seemed to whisper forgotten truths, and I knew I was on the edge of a precipice. How could I confront my son with this colossal revelation about his father and my strange brother? What I decided to do next felt like tearing open old wounds, but I couldn't stop. You'll want to see how this shocking family history finally comes to light. The non-disclosure agreement lay on the floor, a cruel map leading back to a past I had desperately tried to bury. Charles, my brother. The name felt like ash in my mouth. For nearly 50 years, he had been erased from our family narrative, a painful footnote to a youthful folly I barely remembered. Charles, my older brother by 5 years, had always been the wild one, full of big ideas and quick schemes. George, on the other hand, was the steady, pragmatic type. They'd been partners in George's fledgling construction business for a brief, tumultuous period before George and I married. Charles had invested a small inheritance, eager to get rich quick, but his reckless decisions nearly bankrupted George before the business even found its footing. The final blow had come when Charles, in a desperate attempt to cover his own gambling debts, had misused some business funds, putting George in a terrible legal bind. I had been furious, heartbroken, and George, protective as always, had quietly bought Charles out, severing all ties. We never spoke of him again. Or so I thought. Now, it seemed, Charles Harrison was not just a ghost from my past, but a shadow that had fallen over my husband's legacy and my son's life. The document stated that he would never disclose certain proprietary information regarding the operations of Caldwell Construction in exchange for a substantial sum. Had Charles, all these years later, tried to extort money from George? Or, after George's death, from Stephen? My heart ached, not just for the lost money, but for the silent burden George must have carried, the secret he kept even from me. What was this proprietary information? Was it truly damaging? Or was Charles just preying on George's honor code, twisting an old mistake into leverage? The thought of George being blackmailed, even after his death, was a bitter pill to swallow. The silence of the house pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. My hands still trembled, but a new resolve hardened my spine. I had to talk to Stephen. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about uncovering the truth that lay beneath decades of silence, about understanding the hidden layers of the men I loved. I needed to understand why George had kept such a monumental secret from me and why Stephen felt compelled to perpetuate it. This wasn't just George's past. It was our past, tangled and unresolved. I picked up the phone and dialed Stephen's number. My voice, when I spoke, sounded thinner than usual. "Stephen," I began, trying to keep my tone even. "Could you come over this evening? There's something important we need to discuss. Something about your father's affairs." I didn't mention Charles, not yet. I needed to see his face to gauge his reaction. He sounded surprised, but agreed immediately. Of course, Mom. Is everything all right? We'll talk when you get here, I said, my voice barely a whisper. That afternoon, I paced the living room, the old grandfather clock ticking loudly, marking the agonizing minutes. Every object in the room, every photograph, seemed to hold a new, unsettling meaning. The air felt thick with unspoken secrets, pressing down on me. I tried to prepare what I would say, but the words felt clumsy, inadequate. How do you confront your son about a decades-old secret involving your dead husband and your estranged brother? It felt like tearing open old wounds, but I couldn't stop. The need for truth was a burning fire in my gut. When Stephen arrived, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch. He looked tired, his usually neatly combed hair a little disheveled. Linda wasn't with him, which was unusual for their Sunday visits. He gave me a quick hug, a worried frown creasing his brow. Mom, what's going on? You sound distressed. We sat in the living room, the silence between us stretched taut. I held the ledger and the non-disclosure agreement in my lap, feeling the weight of them. Stephen, I started, my voice wavering slightly. I was going through some of your father's old things, and I found this. I handed him the ledger first, then the non-disclosure agreement. His eyes widened as he looked at the ledger, then narrowed as they scanned the legal document. His face, usually so composed, paled dramatically. He looked up at me, his gaze full of a complex mix of surprise, fear, and something else, resignation. Mom, he said, his voice barely a whisper, where did you find these? That's not important, Stephen, I retorted, a flash of anger igniting within me. What does this mean? What does C. Harrison's settlement refer to? And why is this dated just weeks after your father passed? And why does the amount match our savings account exactly? I pointed to the zero balance on the bank statement lying on the coffee table. And why, Stephen, did you drain our life savings without a word to me? The words, once so hard to say, now tumbled out, laced with years of suppressed confusion and hurt. Stephen closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep, ragged breath. He looked defeated, like a heavy burden had finally been lifted, but at a great cost. Mom, he began, his voice hoarse. It's complicated. Dad made me promise. Promise what, Stephen? I pressed, my heart pounding. Promise to keep secrets that drain our future? Promise to protect a reputation by sacrificing our financial security? My voice rose with each word, the indignation swelling inside me. I had nurtured him, trusted him, and now it felt like he had been living a separate, secretive life, one that intertwined with George's hidden past. It wasn't like that, Mom. Not exactly, he said, shaking his head slowly. This C. Harrison, it's your brother, Charles. And what Dad was hiding, it wasn't a business secret in the way you think. Stephen paused, his eyes pleading for me to understand. Dad didn't want you to ever know this. He went to great lengths to protect you from this, and I promised him I would do the same. My mind reeled. Charles. He admitted it. But what could possibly be so terrible that George would spend a fortune to keep it quiet, even from me? And why would Stephen sacrifice our entire future for it? The answers he was about to give me would force me to reevaluate not just Stephen or George, but my own capacity for judgment and how easily even the deepest love can be twisted by fear and misunderstanding. I braced myself, knowing that whatever Stephen was about to reveal would change my perception of my family forever. The full truth, he warned me, was far more shocking and painful than I could have ever imagined.
Stephen took another shaky breath, his gaze fixed on the worn Persian rug beneath his feet, as if the patterns held some answers he couldn't quite articulate. "Mom," he began, his voice softer now, almost a plea, You remember when Dad started Caldwell Construction, right after he got out of the service?" I nodded, a sharp memory of those lean years, George working day and night, building up the business brick by painful brick. "Of course," I said. "It was tough. We barely made ends meet." "And you remember Charles, your brother, joined him for a short while?" "Briefly," I said, my voice tight, "before he nearly ruined George with his schemes. And then he disappeared. Good riddance, I thought. The old resentment, carefully buried for decades, began to surface, bitter and cold." Stephen finally looked up, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own, but deeper, burdened by years of unspoken knowledge. "Mom, what you remember, it's only part of the story, the part Dad wanted you to remember." He paused, as if gathering the courage for a painful confession. "Charles didn't just nearly ruin Dad, Mom. He committed a serious financial fraud using Caldwell Construction's name. Not just for gambling debts, Mom. He forged Dad's signature on several promissory notes, siphoning funds from suppliers, leaving Dad liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt he didn't incur. It could have meant jail time for Dad, or at the very least, total ruin and public humiliation." My jaw dropped. Fraud? Jail? This was far beyond schemes. George had never, not once, hinted at such a dire situation. He'd simply said Charles had been reckless and that he'd bought him out. My mind raced back to those early years. George had been so quiet then, so withdrawn for a time. I had attributed it to the stress of starting a business and the disappointment with Charles. But now a terrifying mosaic began to form. The late nights George worked, not just building, but fixing. The worried lines on his face that I'd brushed off as tiredness. Dad, Stephen continued, his voice heavy with reverence, could have sent Charles to prison. The evidence was overwhelming. But he didn't. He couldn't bear the thought of what it would do to you, to Grandma Caldwell, to the family name. So he used his own personal savings, every penny he had, and every penny he could borrow to silently pay off those debts. He protected Charles, and in doing so, he protected our family's reputation. He rebuilt Caldwell Construction from the ground up, not just a business, but a monument to his quiet integrity. A profound wave of shame washed over me. George saved Charles? And I never knew? I had judged Charles so harshly, banished him from my memory, oblivious to the monstrous burden George had carried. I'd been living in a curated version of our past, protected by my husband's silent sacrifice. The man I loved, the pillar of honesty, had kept a secret of such magnitude to shield me from pain. And I, in my comfortable ignorance, had allowed my own pride and anger to paint Charles as nothing more than a villain. My adult ego state, usually so confident, felt like a naive child. This was the deeper conflict, the moral dilemma. I, too, had been complicit in the unspoken truth, not by design, but by omission and unexamined prejudice. "This non-disclosure agreement," Stephen said, gently picking up the paper from the floor, "it wasn't about blackmail, Mom, not in the way you're thinking. After George settled everything, Charles was broken. He disappeared, yes, but Dad found him years later, destitute, living under a bridge in another state. Charles, in a moment of despair, had considered going to the press, not to hurt Dad, but out of sheer desperation and a twisted sense of guilt, believing that exposing his own crime would finally free him from it. Dad, being Dad, gave him enough money to get back on his feet on the condition that Charles signed this, not as a weapon, but as a A promise that he would never speak of this, never bring that shame back to our family, and that he would try to rebuild his life in silence. It was Dad's final act of quiet mercy. My breath caught in my throat. George, my George, had done that. He had quietly, without a single word to me, saved my brother from prison, rebuilt his business, and then years later reached out to a man who had nearly destroyed him, offering a hand up instead of judgment. The man I thought I knew was even more extraordinary, more compassionate than I had ever dared to imagine. And I, his wife, had been so focused on our comfortable life, so trusting in his quiet strength, that I had missed the silent battles he fought. The bitter irony struck me. I had judged Stephen for secrecy, while my entire life with George had been built upon one enormous protective secret. So the money that vanished from our account, it wasn't for Charles, not directly. I whispered, the words barely audible. Stephen nodded, his eyes meeting mine, finally open and honest. No, Charles passed away a few months ago, Mom. Very quietly. He had no one, no family left, except for a daughter he never knew he had, a daughter he had with a woman he knew briefly before his life spiraled out of control. Her name is Clara. She's in her 40s, and she's a single mother, struggling. She never knew her father. Charles's last wish, a letter I found after his death, was for any remaining assets, any form of restitution he could make, to go to her. He had nothing left except the knowledge of what George had done for him, and in his last days, he wrote to me, asking if there was anything at all that could be done for Clara as a way to right his past wrongs. He knew about the savings account because George, in his incredibly meticulous way, had accounted for the potential for Charles needing help again in the future. This was the ultimate twist, the final, gut-wrenching revelation. Not Charles, but his hidden daughter, and not for debt, but for an act of pure, selfless redemption. My world tilted on its axis, forcing me to confront not just my family's buried past, but my own long-held judgments and the profound, silent love that had orchestrated it all. What was I supposed to do with this truth, this aching, beautiful, devastating truth?
The air left my lungs, replaced by a suffocating mix of revelation and regret. How could I have been so wrong about my son, about my husband, and even about my own brother? This wasn't just a story about lost money. It was about the silent burdens of love and the blinding nature of pride. Every memory, every judgment began to twist into something new, and the weight of what I hadn't seen was almost unbearable. You'll want to see how I began to put the pieces of my shattered understanding back together. Clara hung in the air, a delicate, unexpected chime in the storm that had just ravaged my understanding. My brother, Charles, had a daughter he never knew, a daughter I never knew existed. And Stephen, my steadfast son, had used our family's future to honor a dead man's dying wish, to quietly offer redemption to a branch of the family I had actively pruned from my memory. The silence that followed Stephen's revelation was not empty. It was filled with the deafening sound of my own shattered assumptions. I sank back into the armchair, the worn velvet feeling foreign beneath my hands. My mind was a whirlwind of images. George, always so calm, carrying the weight of Charles's misdeeds without a word. Stephen, meticulously managing finances, not for greed, but for an act of profound, silent generosity, protecting his father's memory and trying to right a half-century-old wrong. And me, the matriarch, so certain of my version of the truth, so quick to condemn, so blind to the nuanced complexities of the lives around me. The shame that had initially flared when I suspected Stephen now burned hotter, sharper. This was not his betrayal. It was mine. a betrayal of trust born of my own inability to see beyond the surface. "Mom?" Stephen's voice was gentle, pulling me back from the precipice of my internal storm. He knelt beside my chair, his hand tentatively reaching for mine. "Are you all right?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the thief I had imagined, but a man burdened by loyalty, by a promise, by a love so deep it compelled him to silence. His eyes, usually so clear, were clouded with the echo of his father's burdens. My own internal dialogue shifted. The accusatory parent receded, replaced by a flood of empathy. This wasn't just a story about a transfer of money. It was a testament to a quiet heroism I had never acknowledged. "No, Stephen," I whispered, my voice rough with unshed tears. "I'm not all right. I'm so sorry. So terribly sorry. I thought the worst." I squeezed his hand, my grip tightening. All these years, I judged Charles so harshly. I pushed him from my mind. I never knew what George truly endured, or the incredible grace he extended. And you carried this, all alone. "Dad made me promise, Mom. He said you'd worry. He said it would bring back too many painful memories, especially after everything with Charles first happened. He just wanted to protect you. And when Charles died and I found his letter, I felt an obligation, not just to Charles, but to Dad's memory, to finish what he started, to ensure Clara got a chance at a better life. It was the right thing to do, even if it meant you'd be upset." His words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with Carl Rogers' idea of unconditional positive regard. Stephen, like George, had acted out of a profound sense of compassion, regardless of the personal cost, and I had judged him through the lens of my own limited perception. I remembered a specific conversation with George years ago when he said, "Sometimes, Maggie, the greatest strength is in quiet understanding, not in outward displays." I thought he meant patience with me, with my occasional fussing. Now I understood he was talking about himself, about the burdens he carried. I closed my eyes, a wave of bittersweet emotions washing over me. The pain of the lost money was still there, a dull ache, but it was overshadowed by the profound awe and gratitude for the men in my life. George, my steady, honest George, had harbored a secret, not of deceit, but of immense silent mercy. And Stephen, my son, had inherited that same quiet, self-sacrificing spirit. My journey through this unexpected landscape of hidden truths felt like a narrative therapy session, where the story of my family was being reauthored before my very eyes. The memories of Charles, once so tainted by my own anger and dismissal, now took on a different hue. He wasn't just the reckless one. He was the one that George had saved, the one whose dying wish had been for quiet restitution. The villain in my story had become a tragic figure, and the hero, George, had revealed even greater depth. This wasn't a simple tale of good versus evil. It was a complex tapestry of human frailty, forgiveness, and unspoken love. I finally managed to sit up straighter, the weight on my shoulders easing slightly. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock now felt less oppressive, more like a steady heartbeat. I looked around our living room at the familiar worn furniture, the framed photographs, and for the first time in days, they felt like home again, but a home with a deeper foundation, built not just on bricks and mortar, but on layers of secret sacrifices and unspoken loyalties. The money was gone, yes, but what I had gained was immeasurable. A profound re-understanding of my family and a sobering realization of my past judgments. The lingering question, however, was what this new understanding truly meant for our future. And for Clara, the unexpected new thread in our family's intricate weave. I knew then that my journey was far from over. The truth had set me free from my assumptions, but it had also opened a new chapter
one that demanded a different kind of courage. What would I do with this knowledge? And how would I embrace the unexpected legacy George and Stephen had quietly built for someone I had never known?
After all the secrets, the anger, and the agonizing truth, what was left? I stood at a crossroads, holding the fate of my family and a stranger in my hands. Would I cling to my old ways or embrace a future built on a deeper understanding of love and sacrifice? This final chapter reveals not just my choice, but a profound lesson about forgiveness and the unexpected paths our hearts can lead us down. You won't want to miss the bittersweet peace I've finally found. The days that followed Stephen's revelation were a strange blend of quiet introspection and restless energy. My morning coffee still brewed and the honeysuckle still bloomed, but everything felt imbued with a new, deeper meaning. The house, once a fortress of familiar comforts, now felt like a living archive of untold stories, each creak of the floorboards a whisper of secrets kept and burdens borne. I found myself sitting for long stretches in George's old armchair, tracing the patterns on the fabric, trying to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the silent hero Stephen had unveiled. It was a process of peeling back layers, each one revealing a truth more profound than the last. The initial shock had given way to a quiet, aching sorrow. Not sorrow for the money, that felt almost trivial now, but for the years of ignorance, for the silent battles George had fought alone, for the burden Stephen had carried out of loyalty. I had always prided myself on my empathy, on my ability to understand people. Yet I had failed to see the quiet strength in the men closest to me, blinded by my own expectations and a stubborn adherence to my version of their past. This realization, as Carl Rogers might have observed, was the cornerstone of my transformation, a path toward true self-acceptance and a deeper understanding of others. I remembered a conversation George and I had years ago, just after we paid off the mortgage. He'd leaned back in this very chair, a contented sigh escaping him. "We did it, Maggie," he'd said. "Built it ourselves, just like we built our life. Honest and true." And he was honest and true, but in ways I hadn't understood. His honesty wasn't just about financial transparency. It was about the profound integrity of his character, a willingness to shoulder immense burdens to protect those he loved, even when it meant keeping painful truth hidden. My conflict between my desire to be a useful matriarch and my underlying fear of being a burden began to resolve itself. I had always felt a need to be in the loop, to understand every detail, a subtle control born of anxiety. But George's and Stephen's actions showed me a different kind of strength, the strength to trust, even when details are withheld for protective reasons. It was a hard lesson for someone who liked everything neat and accounted for. I finally called Stephen again. "Stephen, I want to meet Clara, your cousin, Charles's daughter." He paused, a surprised inhale on the other end of the line. "Are you sure, Mom? She doesn't know anything about any of this. She just thinks a distant relative left her some money, a small inheritance from her estranged father." "I know," I said, "and I don't intend to upset her with all the painful details, but she's family, and I need to meet her. I need to see the legacy of George's compassion and of your loyalty through her eyes." My decision was firm. This wasn't about reclaiming money. It was about reclaiming a lost piece of our family's story, about embracing the full, complex truth of who we were. It was my journey's irreversible moment, a decision that would not allow me to return to my previous comfortable ignorance. A week later, Stephen drove me to a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of town. It was modest, but well kept, with a cheerful splash of impatience blooming in window boxes. Clara opened the door. She had Charles's eyes, I realized instantly. The same striking blue, though hers were softer, kind, etched with the faint lines of a life lived with quiet struggle. She was a single mother, Stephen had told me, working as a librarian, raising a bright, curious 10-year-old girl named Lily. We didn't talk about George's secrets or Charles's past. We talked about Lily's school projects, about the best way to grow tomatoes in a small yard, about the simple joys and hardships of everyday life. Clara was gracious, polite, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected generosity from her distant relative. As she poured us iced tea in her sun-dappled kitchen, I saw a reflection of myself, perhaps, in her quiet resilience. As I sat there, sipping my tea, watching Lily draw intently at the kitchen table, a profound sense of peace settled over me. The money was gone, yes, but it had gone to a good place, to a deserving woman and her daughter who had been unwittingly caught in the currents of our family's hidden history. This was not a story of betrayal, but of profound, if secret, self-sacrifice. It was a testament to the enduring power of love, even in its most hidden forms. George's silent act of mercy, Stephen's unwavering loyalty, these were the true riches, far more valuable than any sum in a bank account. I looked at Stephen, who was watching me with a hopeful, anxious expression. I gave him a small, heartfelt nod, a silent apology, and a gesture of profound gratitude. He understood. The unspoken acknowledgement hung in the air between us, a new, stronger bond, forged in the crucible of shared truth. That evening, back in my quiet home, the honeysuckle scent drifted in, as comforting as it had ever been. I walked into George's study, pulled out his old fishing box from the closet, and rummaged through the lures and tangled lines. Deep inside, beneath a coil of sturdy monofilament, I found it. A small, tarnished silver locket I'd given him on our first anniversary. Inside were two tiny faded photos, one of a young George beaming, and the other a surprisingly clear image of a much younger Charles, his arm thrown around George's shoulder, both laughing. It was a picture I thought had been lost, or perhaps I had simply chosen to forget it. George had kept it, a silent symbol of a bond he never truly severed, of a compassion he extended even to those who had wronged him. The money had been a test not of loyalty, but of my own capacity to forgive, to understand, and to see the true nature of love in its most unexpected and quiet forms. And in the end, I found not just peace, but a profound gratitude for the hidden depths of my family's heart, a depth I had almost missed entirely. Some questions, I realized, are better left unanswered, their ambiguity allowing for a deeper, more personal reflection on the complex, beautiful tapestry of life.